Welcome to Deep Focus, a radio show about movies and New Haven. I'm your host, Tom Breen. On today's review-only episode of the show, I'll be joined by the New Haven Independent's Alan Appel to talk about Chappaquiddick.
Hey, Tom.
Hey, Alan. It's great to have you back, or great to be back, or great to be back with you. Some combination. I'm happy is happening right now. So yes, the movie we're going to talk about today is John Curran's new dramatization of the night of and the week after July 18th, 1969. Which was a night, or I guess very early in the morning, when U.S. Senator from Massachusetts Ted Kennedy, the youngest of the four Kennedy brothers that so captivated the American political imagination and really popular cultural imagination in the 1960s, drove his car, or his car was driven off of a narrow bridge on the island of Chappaquiddick in Martha's Vineyard. Landing top first in about 8 feet of water. He was able to escape the wreckage, but a young woman who was in the car with him, Mary Jo Kopechne, a former aide to his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, who had been assassinated the previous year during his own presidential campaign, she died in the accident. Now, if this were not enough, Mr. Kennedy immediately told his friends and closest advisors, but neglected to tell the police about the accident and about the death of Miss Kopechne I think it was around 9 or 10 hours after the accident had occurred. This movie stars Jason Clarke as Ted Kennedy, as the kind of sullenly and broodingly arrogant youngest of the Kennedy brothers. In that night and in the week after, as he's frantically trying to cobble together the damage control team necessary, or at least that his father deems necessary, to preserve his own political career, which would go on to be a pretty spectacular and long political career, much longer than any of his brothers.
Right, but not really as a presidential
Never
person, which is a big part of the drama of the movie.
And quite humiliatingly so, if that is an adverb. I think, at least for Kennedy, in the context of this movie, his own intense ambivalence about whether or not he wants to be president, coupled by the impossibility of being president with this, very sordid tale in his history, is something that the movie really plays up. So, Alan, I'm going to ask you. We're going to take a kind of a historical sidestep into our review of this movie, because I remember the very first movie that you and I reviewed on this program. It's called Best of Enemies, back in the summer of 2015. This was a documentary about the rivalry between pundits Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley Jr.
That's right.
Leading up to the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, when one of those two called the other a fascist, the other called the other some derogatory homosexual slur. I'm blanking on the specifics of the vocabulary,
Right.
but it's kind of the beginning of the punditocracy that we are kind of awash in today in most news, TV news coverage. And you spoke about your own personal experience in Grant Park in Chicago during the 1968 protests, and I was so fascinated by your own connection to the movies you were talking about. I wonder if you could take our listeners back to 1969. You mentioned before the show that Chappaquiddick may not be as seared in your own personal memory as something like the Chicago Democratic Convention was, but when you hear the word Chappaquiddick, it's such a code word. It's like this shibboleth for political sides as to, whether it means this great tragedy or like a witch hunt after, a great Democratic politician. What does the word Chappaquiddick mean to you?
Well, it's interesting you ask, because it to me it means the bridge, it means the incident, but I do wonder if you're unusual for your generation, because I'm thinking of people in their 30s and 40s. If you say Chappaquiddick to them, it may not instantly evoke this incident that this John Curran film is based on. But I'll tell you what was in the Department of what historical moments are evoked for me, and the general question of truth or stretching the truth in film, which I think is an interesting question about this movie, especially for you as a full-time running around day and night reporter trying to get the facts, sir, and only the facts for the New Haven Independent. One of my big questions here, as I was trying to kind of sort through my own memories, is, did this really happen at the same time that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon? Because one of the most entertaining of the lines in the story is when is when the team of Kennedy fixers, to use a very current expression, comes together to try to put the best face on what Ted Kennedy did. One of them says, when the story begins to leak, I mean, the only thing that will keep this from being a headline for 3 weeks is if a man walks on the moon. And lo and behold, the gods have provided this.
It's a great line.
Yeah. So apparently it was at the same time. And I have, to answer your question specifically, I have a very vivid memory of, you should know this as a fellow Columbia University person, of being in a bar on 111th and Broadway where they were giving away free beer in honor of the moon landing, which I thought was very appropriate. The bar on 111th Street to watch Neil Armstrong walk down the ladder. Now, whether Chappaquiddick was going on at the same time, or indeed, backburnered, or it's certainly they benefited from this, because I have no contemporary memory of that. Although when I did mention it to my wife, she said it was so creepy for her. I don't think she had specific recollections, but she remembered the feeling of the whole thing being so awful, the drowning, that she was not interested in joining me at the Bowtie cinema where I saw it.
So I think that, part of it is that Chappaquiddick, the word, is so unforgettable. It doesn't sound like a lot of words that I use on a day-to-day basis, and so it's
sure
one
it
that
does.
has kind of
it's the same as Connecticut. It's Connecticut.
Right. Yes. Well, but perhaps, I think that what I think I was first introduced to the story of Chappaquiddick during my high school years fascination with the story of Woodward and Bernstein and Watergate and All the President's Men, and learning that part of the very intense research that Nixon's very shady bit of electioneering operators looked into was digging up as much dirt as they could on Chappaquiddick because of a fear that Ted Kennedy was going to be the Democratic nominee in 1972. Of course, he did not run for president in 72, but I think it was introduced to me as a young kind of aspiring or admiring journalist as a topic that the arch nemesis of liberals everywhere, Richard Nixon, used to target an upstanding Democratic politician. Now, this, of course, Ted Kennedy's legacy is a lot more complicated than that. And I think that this movie, especially in the way we'll talk, a little later on about how it ends, I think quite cynically in its description of the unreserved, uninhibited support that people still had, almost a blind faith that they had in the Kennedys as an American icon that they were willing to overlook. An act that it's rare that we are in a time we are used to people at the highest levels of political office committing pretty sordid scandals. See the Stormy Daniels stuff with President Trump and his lawyer paying over $100,000 to quiet a porn star he had an affair with. But it's rare to have someone ascending to that level of office who is implicated in the death of someone quite directly. And I think that this movie is quite searing in its, again, it's a dramatization, but quite searing in its criticism of what it sees as let's go to that juxtaposition of the moon landing and the privilege and arrogance of the youngest Kennedy. Here we have all of the idealism, the progress, the scientific advancement of putting a man on the moon, juxtaposed with a woman drowning in 8 feet of water because a young privileged senator was drunk. Did you find that juxtaposition in the movie? Did it provoke any contemplation in you about the legacy of the Kennedys more broadly here, a good 50 years after?
Well, I think it suggests that people really want to have hope. People really want to believe in idealism. People want to believe in the kinds of things that certainly Jack Kennedy sold me on back in 1960 with the Peace Corps and his initial commitment to go to the moon. But the movie, so I think that's one of the most effective kind of threads of juxtaposition that goes through the whole film. On the other hand, it really, at its heart, it's very cynical, because it really suggests that the innate idealism of human beings notwithstanding, that really needed to be nurtured along by a huge amount of fixers. I mean, to me, one of the very most dramatic moments in the movie is right after the first call that Ted makes, according to the movie. And I don't know how much is dramatic license here. This is one of the serious issues in this whole genre.
But I think that we should, we talk about a lot of movies based on real. We should talk about this, how it makes us think about history, but the actual events portrayed in the movie, it's a movie. So I think there's only so. This isn't a documentary. It isn't pertaining to, especially the night of Chappaquiddick. I think it's kind of impossible to know exactly what happened on that bridge.
Well, it does. It evades all the questions. Did he try to save her or didn't he? The movie doesn't make that decision. But what's really was shocking to me is and is this true even? The very first call he made when he finally made calls was not to the police, but was to his father, Joe Kennedy, played by a harrowing Bruce Dern. That was scary. So Joe Kennedy, the patriarch, is in the midst of recovering from a stroke, which in fact he does not recover from. He dies 3 or 4 months after the Chappaquiddick incident, but and because he's not able to talk, Jason Clarke, who wonderfully plays Ted Kennedy, leans into the phone and all he hears is alibi, alibi. The only word Joe Kennedy can say is don't tell the truth, don't think about your integrity, alibi. And really, the most powerful tension in the movie is this pressure on Ted to do anything, including coming up with alibis and manipulating the local police and the press in order to fulfill old Joe's dream of having another of his sons become president. That is scary as all get out. Is it true? Is there a dramatic license? I mean, you say it's a movie, but it made me actually think, for example, of the genre and the film closest to it is the 13 Days, where Ted does not appear, but it's about JFK and RFK with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and there were liberties taken with that. There are many Kennedy people as well as conservative people who criticize this film we're talking about. The Kennedy supporters feel that the film portrays Ted at the end succumbing to the manipulation for the sake of his future presidential run. On the other hand, I was reading in some review that some of the Kennedy speechwriters say that's utterly untrue, that he was tortured and haunted the rest of his life. So I don't know what's true and not, and it kind of you don't ask it while the movie's going on if it's effective, but it really is worth asking about if somebody who has never heard of Chappaquiddick encounters it for the very first time in this film, they're going to get a slice of history that's questionable. Right.
Well, yes, I agree that they're going to get a narrative presented unambiguously, whereas historically it is entirely. I mean, there's so many questions as to how this actually played out, and this movie does not explore, what could have happened. This, it has a definite story that it's telling, and then it follows it through, and that's the big challenge of responding to and trying to understand dramatizations of based on true stories. But I do want to maybe pivot a bit more to the cinema angle and leave history as represented by the movie to the side just for a second. I think that one of the most effective cinematic moments in the movie for me that really played up the key theme of this kind of Rashomon-like playing with truth and history are these two kind of tracking shots alongside the house that Kennedy and his friends have rented in Chappaquiddick, describing the events through the windows of the different rooms. I don't know if you remember these moments, but the first time that we get to this house where, Kennedy and his friends, they've invited all of the boiler room girls, all of the young female secretaries who worked on Robert Kennedy's campaign, and we see through each window of the room, they're drinking, they're dancing, they're smoking, they're partying, they're trying to corral different women into bed. It's like all of the carousing that we would expect from, of like the hedonistic side of the Kennedy legend. And then when Ted Kennedy is telling that same story to the police for the first time, a good 10 hours later in the context of the movie, but maybe 45 minutes later in the movie that we're watching, we see that same shot, the camera pulling alongside the house, but instead inside each window we see a very like docile dinner party, and we see people like leaning back and laughing, and people listening to music quite respectfully and contemplatively. And the way that Kennedy tries, however haplessly, to take control over a story that is rapidly spinning out of his control, I found a really, that's something that I think movies can communicate really well. How, sometimes the people who think they are, the more in control you think you are of a story, the more frantically that you grasp at trying to clamp down on whatever like narrative is quickly spilling through your fingers, the more out of control it gets. And
So
the harder you push, the more that it flies. I thought the movie communicated that part of like the helplessness of this very arrogant character quite well.
So you're suggesting that that tracking shot you described, the cinema technique, makes it's implying, or we're supposed to infer what that from window to window to window, there are things that we need to get control of. Is that the
no? I think
so
I
what's
think
the?
I think it's.
I'm not sure.
It's just one. It's one in a movie that I found relatively uninteresting to look at for most of it. It didn't. It has fascinating characters, a fascinating story, but the way that whether how this functions as a movie,
Oh, the
I found
camera is
unexceptional.
relatively static.
But
and
the way
right,
that
right.
particular technique communicates how this character is desperately trying to, again, take control of a narrative that he has quickly lost control of because he delayed and telling the police, because he has an
right.
inept team.
Well, this is so
interesting.
interesting how the director's what do you call it, visual vocabulary means something to you, and to me it meant something utterly different. I think just as potent, but those tracking shots, and especially the ones preceding it, where we first get to see Edgerton and the island with the marshes. The camera is moving very, very slowly, and it's isolated, and then we see a house. To me, that evoked the style of a horror movie. It evoked to me the sense, it was saying to me cinematically, along with the quite spooky music, that evil here lurks, that something is going to happen here that's quite contrary to everything you're seeing. There's humanity inside the house, and people are interacting in a kind of appropriate, if frisky ways, but there's evil lurking on the outside. Of course, what the evil is the battle that Ted Kennedy has internally and with his father.
And I think that as much as the foil character, his cousin Joe Gargan, played by Ed Helms,
right? He's the good guy.
He's the good guy, and I found that I don't know. I found the relationship between the father and the son much more effective for me than the kind of moral pressure put on by the good guy cousin. But there is one line that character delivers that I found quite moving, which is that he tells his cousin Ted Kennedy that this is not a moment for like political opportunity. This is a moment for like moral responsibility or something. It was I forget the exact word that he uses to counterpoint opportunity, but it shows so clearly how this Ted Kennedy has been at least Ted Kennedy, the character in this movie, has been so trained by that pressure put upon by his father that every crisis, every happy moment, everything is an opportunity to advance your own political career.
Yeah, it's quite terrible the way he's a prisoner of all that. And to me, the very most revealing line is, I guess it's before the accident, where he's on his knee basically in front of Mary Jo Kopechne, and there's a real kind of friendship there. And he basically, she knows what he's struggling. She knows the family. She's worked for RFK as a secretary, and he basically says, "I don't know who I am." She asks him, "Well, who are you? What should?" Oh, he's struggling with should he run for president, and she asks him who, and he says, "I just don't know who I am." He's basically a bundle of forces that are competing against him. He wants to figure out who he is, and there's really something quite beautifully done about the way they focus in on these forces that are are within him. His own desire to try to discover himself, the incredible power of his father over him.
I mean, he even articulates
Right.
that to his father when he says Joe Senior Joe Junior was the favorite child. Jack Kennedy was the charming child. Robert
Right.
Kennedy was the brilliant child.
Right.
And what does that leave to me? I'm the
That's
one
right.
who gets in most trouble, right? And of course, the great irony is that he is the one who has, he winds up being the fourth longest serving senator in U.S. history.
He does find his way.
A model of kind of bipartisan political efficacy, especially now at a time when working across the aisle seems so distant from possibility. He really seemed to embody during his actual political career an ability to get things done and to advocate for people with disabilities, to advocate for
Right.
the Voting Rights Act. Quite an effective political career, and yet here he is at the very beginning of it, seeing no place for himself within the myth of Camelot.
But you could even make the case, and the movie doesn't make the case, but I think it makes quite a strong suggestion that there's something about Mary Jo Kopechne and his, whatever his relationship with her is. And here again, the movie kind of hides from, it doesn't suggest that they had a sexual relationship. Even the Kennedy's married, and he's got lots of kids. But it suggests there is a level of intimacy between them, and there's something about that that plants itself in Kennedy. You could make the movie is making the suggestion that had it not been for Chappaquiddick, he might not have gone down the route that he took. He ran for president once, as if to say in 1980 he was a kind of giving the last nod to his father. And after that, he said, screw it, I want to try to do some good in the world in my own way.
Right, an obligatory presidential run. I think a lot of people think back on that as, and also, he, I think, quite infamously could not come up with many good reasons for why he was running for president in 1980. That was one of the reasons why he failed against the incumbent, to successfully challenge Jimmy Carter.
But we really should point out that, I don't know, there's no point in trying to go point by point, getting back to what kind of departure this is from reality, but or not reality, but from the events. But I know, for example, in 13 Days, which was Kevin Costner as Kenny O'Donnell, one of the Kennedy aides, who does not appear in this movie. That's sort of the Joe Gargan character here, but. According to McNamara and some other people who were very close, Kenny O'Donnell in real life was basically in a secretarial role and was not the conscience of RFK and JFK during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So if you see that movie and you really want to know the history, you have to open up a lot of books.
Right.
We're maybe confronted with the same thing here, although. It's better, as you're suggesting, to treat this as fiction. And as fiction, you have a really Shakespearean struggle here with a guy like Kennedy trying to overcome, kind of terrible flaws within him.
So let's go to the characters and the performances. But first, let me remind listeners that you're listening to Deep Focus on WNHH-LP, New Haven's home for community radio. I'm your host, Tom Breen, and I'm talking with the New Haven Independent's Alan Appel today about the new movie Chappaquiddick by director John Curran that retells, that dramatizes the story of Ted Kennedy's. It's so difficult to say his car going off the bridge, but I guess that's what we have to say. Most likely, he was the one driving and drove off the bridge, and a woman died because of it, and it spoiled his political career forever. And he did not.
But the movie did sort that out, because the first story put out was that he wasn't driving, and then since it was going to be easy to find out, probably she couldn't drive. I don't know. But
so I think we both admired Jason Clarke's performance as Ted Kennedy. What did you like about it? Any particular scenes jump out when he's wearing the neck brace? I mean, I feel like he brought us kind of sullen arrogance and humor to this spoiled child who wasn't just repugnant. He's someone you could sympathize with. He's brooding, right? He's a young brooding man who doesn't really know what he wants, has a lot of responsibility put on him, and he has little impulse control.
Well, first of all, there's a remarkable likeness to the real Ted Kennedy.
I did not pick up on that. Maybe I just didn't look at enough old pictures of Ted Kennedy from his late 30s, but they look similar.
He got heavy and puffy as he got more successful and potent in the Senate. But yeah, no, it's got the same. His face has the same dimensions, and sometimes you're bothered by whether they've made the right casting choice, and whether they've got the right accent. He's Australian, I believe, a well-known Australian actor. Jason
I thought his
Clarke.
accent was pretty spot on.
I thought it was really good. Yeah, the others were having some trouble, and the register was going up and down. Do you remember Von Meter? He was a Massachusetts guy. He used to do these great Kennedy impersonations. There's a way you can do that both is kind of pays homage to it and makes fun of it at the same time.
Mm.
But this was different. This was low key. No, I thought that. In this movie rises and falls on whether you want to spend time with this actor's face,
Yeah.
and I think he really does a good job at in many visual close-ups, at conveying his torturous internal struggle, and the way he swings from let's cover it up to let's not cover it up, and I think that to me those the moments when he confronts his team of fixers, which we should talk about, because those are the elements that really are, as I think you indicated, are most resonant. But they're very good. He knows he's not as smart as they are, but he knows he's the prince, and he's the bearer of the tradition. And they are McNamara, Sorensen. They're all more brilliant than he is, but they are his team. And I love the way he goes around ordering everybody to, you do this, you cover up this, you talk to the police. I mean, he's really it's very regal the way he deals with that.
But what's so wonderful about the relationship between the fixers and Kennedy is that, yes, he's the prince, but no one in that room seems to have any respect for him, right? Because he is, again, the black sheep of the family. They know that they have to pay. They don't just have to pay homage to the family. They have a lot of respect for, again, the idealism and political ambition and power and inspiration of the Kennedys as a whole. But now they're stuck with the one who did not go out as the president, as the man running for president, as the one inspiring, millions of Americans to realize their best and most service-oriented selves. Instead, we have someone who got drunk and drove a car off a bridge, resulting in a woman's death, and now they have to spend as much of their intellectual and political capital covering for this dud of a child, and yet still he is a Kennedy and is able to win them over with his fierceness, his indomitability.
Well, he just is able to step into the role, and it's clearly he's acting the role when after they've given him all this advice to do this and do that, he takes it all in, and then he says, "All right, gentlemen, what this requires is a great gesture," and then it's he who comes up with the idea of doing the address in front of the public, and so he comes up with that. And they all say, well, maybe he is not so stupid after all. That's a great idea.
But definitely, I'd say the funnest moments in the movie for me are the ones with the fixers, right? That's when
totally.
maybe the best throwaway lines are with, something like the Bay of Pigs was better handled than this.
There's a great line. I just jotted it down here, and I found it. I could actually read my little notes. I forget what the context is, but they're all trying to, they all say they need to preserve him as this great legislative leader, like a Moses or something like that. And then one of the guys, maybe it's Joe Gargan, the close friend who's also sort of the fixer with the most integrity, he says, "Yeah, Teddy, but Moses didn't leave a girl at the bottom of the Red Sea."
Is there also a line, even Moses had a temper? So I don't know. But yeah, that's certainly, it's an interesting and, again, fun, I think successful counterpoint with Steven Spielberg's The Post, which I believe we spoke about at the end of last year, which is more of an exercise in hagiography of these great men of history and great women of history, whereas this is the backroom strategizing in Chappaquiddick is anything but like laudatory. It's people being quite effective, but putting their powers to somewhat suspect.
Right, and if we reflect on another recent movie we talked about, also with historical figures, it's The Death of Stalin. It's all very curious as to why creative people keep on going back to actual events to find entertainment and drama or veins to mine, as opposed to making stuff up from whole cloth. There's something about our trying to understand it better or to get closer to it, or I don't know what the impulse is to do like historical fiction, as it were, as opposed to fiction.
Well, to say a truism, I think that sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. That the wildest thing that one can imagine has sometimes been superseded by what has actually happened. And I think there's a certain effect that comes from watching people who actually existed, to reading stories of people who actually were flesh and blood and not just products of the imagination, and hearing about their struggles and their faults and their moments of survival and overcoming. I think that there's just if ever to speculate, a more kind of natural connection to someone who actually existed, as opposed to someone imagined by a creator, even though these figures are as much the products of the imagination of the directors. I mean, I don't credit this as a documentary or a history textbook. This is, but dramatization.
And if you look at it from a kind of writer's point of view, as I do sometimes, it's in a way easier to deal with a character from history like Ted Kennedy or Stalin, because in many instances you don't have to communicate the ABCs of who this person is to an audience. Right. Instantly, 500 things about this person. Whereas if you're dealing with like King Lear, like, who the hell is King Lear? You have to explain who he is in order before you can get going with your story. So I can see why people are drawn to that. In many ways, it's a head start creatively.
So we both use the word cynical in describing this movie at the beginning of our review, and I think maybe as we begin to wrap this up, I want to return to that adjective, because I think that, again, the Kennedys are all about hope, right? The whole family, the very incredibly kind of memorable kind of one-liners that one thinks of and that are recited over the course of this movie. The ask not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country. We go to the moon in this decade not because it is difficult, but because it is hard, I think, is one that is discussed at the very beginning of the movie. Even Neil Armstrong's One Small Step for Man, One Great Leap for Mankind is kind of under the umbrella of this type of pithy, idealism and aspiration that the Kennedys inspire. And here we have a character and a movie that ends, I think, ends quite confidently saying that this is a figure who, if he didn't directly kill someone, he's quite responsible for her death, and yet he is able to use that, however much guilt he feels, he's not punished for it, and he's ultimately given opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to realize the political career that was, laid out before him before birth because of his heritage. So I think that this is a movie about political privilege, and again, that we're quite familiar with, considering how the current president kind of grew up with the silver spoon in his mouth, having everything offered to him, and yet a very different figure, in that Donald Trump is not out there advocating for people with disabilities, whereas Ted Kennedy, got the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Right. I think that's the point, that we're able to forgive people who need fixers in order to promote their images.
So cynical still an appropriate adjective for this movie, if not Ted Kennedy's story more broadly?
Well,
we can forgive.
I would say it's CNN has a whole series on the Kennedys now, so I would say it's a healthy antidote to the hagiography of the Kennedys, and whether that's the same thing as saying cynical, I don't know. But I think it's. I think Kennedy emerges, as a lot of the Kennedys do, maybe except for Joe, the patriarch. These are people who are, who are, and I don't know. The more you learn about JFK, also the more you learn that his feet of clay are pretty huge. RFK is probably the one who is the true prince, right. But that doesn't come through.
Right. Although it is interesting that, obviously 1969 is a lot closer to 1968 than to 1963. But I think that Ted Kennedy's story in the context of this movie is much more presented as in the shadow of RFK than in JFK.
Sure.
Yes, we do have the moon landing, and we do have the connection between, JFK's advocacy for the space program and then the fruition of it in 1969. But I mean, Mary Jo Kopechne was an aide to RFK, and Ted Kennedy calls him the brilliant one. He recognizes the seemingly successful presidential campaign he was running. RFK seems to be casting the most painful shadow, and of course that's what supposedly Ted Kennedy was, as devastated as one can imagine. He was just completely hobbled by RFK's assassination, and somehow managed to, I don't know, I guess first drive a car for bridge, but then lead his own 4-decade political career. Man, what a remarkable story. But Alan, I appreciate it. So, recommendation for Chappaquiddick?
Yeah, sure,
check it out.
absolutely. Absolutely.
It's playing down.
But it was everything else. You have to go to the library afterwards.
Yeah. Spoken like a true teacher and author. I love it. And writer. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's a pleasure to have you as always.
Thank you very much, Tom.
And you can catch Chappaquiddick definitely at the Criterion Cinema downtown New Haven, but also I think it's got a pretty wide release. You can go to deepfocusradio.com for over nearly 3 years of conversations about movies at New Haven, and we will catch up with you next week for another review of a new release. Rough.